Okay, well, Jerry Bowyer, brother, I is super excited to have you on the show and have the guests learn about you and a very diverse, fascinating background. So thank you, brother, for taking the time to join us today.
My pleasure, Jason. Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, so let's get started. Learn a little bit about your background. I know you've done a lot of things professionally. Can you kind of give us a summary of that, and then also your educational background?
Well, goodness, it's a varied career. It would be hard to kind of summarize it unless I very much go to kind of 35,000 feet to summarize it. What I would say is that throughout all of my life, I have at the same time been somebody who's been involved with money, actual money, either finance, auditing, investment management, forecasting, etc., actual business, and also on a track that is media, thought leader, worldview ish. So those have always been going on. Sometimes I've been more on one than the other, right? Sometimes, so there was a time when I was with, a big six accounting firm, auditing mutual funds, but also doing a little radio hosting on the side. And there are some times when I was running a think tank and doing lots and lots of policy work, and debate and dealing with big issues, but also maybe sitting on an investment committee on the side. But both of those things have always been in a parallel track. And recently they've come together a good deal more in that the work that I'm doing in finance is to a large degree what's growing for us, and we maybe get into this a little bit later, is interacting with corporations from the standpoint of their investors, trying to get them back on track, focused on the core business issue, and out of dabbling in the cultural revolution. Companies like Target and Disney, but not just them, everybody to one degree or another. I help with, say, ETFs, which if someone's not in finance, mutual funds now are ETFs.
There you
The
go.
thing that a lot of people grew up and thought about as mutual funds. Pretty much people don't really start mutual funds anymore. They start something called ETF, and then they don't even know it's a difference. So it's an investment fund. Helping the investment funds we work with, institutional investors, advocate for their worldview with these companies. So that these things are kind of merged together to a degree they've never been merged together before. So, I was an accounting major in college. That was Robert Morris, and I came out of there, worked for Arthur Andersen, then worked for a family office for a family that owned and does own a very large mutual fund family. And then from there, I was a pension administrator for an actuarial firm. And then I went and did the think tank thing for a while, then media, and also serving on a number of investment committees. About 12 years ago, I got involved with some institutional investors and some large Christian financial advisors, helping them to build out solutions in investing and also to do macroeconomic forecasting. And in the past, say, 4 years, and really a lot in the past 2 years, I've really gotten into the area of proxy voting, which is a highly specialized area, but extremely important, where investors, whether it's an individual investor or a fund owner, they have votes. And so they can elect boards of directors or not reelect them, and they can vote on various proposals having to do with governance issues or increasingly ESG proposals that are political. And that's that's the growth side of the business.
Good.
Also, there's always been a certain amount of church involvement. I'm an ordained deacon. So in the tradition that I was working, that's clergy, not if you're a Baptist or if you're a deacon, you're on the deacon's board. Usually, that's like a board member.
Yeah.
But in the tradition which I was serving, that's ordained. So there's guest preaching and doing various sorts of ministry. So that's as much as I can summarize it without getting into a long, long
Yeah.
history, which someone can read on the bio
Yeah, and
or the Wikipedia
as
page.
I well, and I read that, yeah, as I prepared for this and read that, I'm like, this Jerry's done a lot, and you're still doing a lot, and we'll talk a little bit in the end about how people can connect with you or follow you. I know that you write for World News Group, which is I'm a huge fan of. Been following those guys for a decade, so yeah, like to follow you on there and many other places. So
Yeah, I have a piece in World Today as of the time of this recording, right, which is largely a review of David
yeah,
Bahnsen's new book about work and the meaning of your life, or work, the meaning of your life, which is a terrific book. And so I've got a piece on WNG.com today talking about
that
that.
was a great book, and I was yeah, I ate that book up in about a week, and then I was super excited to interview him, and I get that out there too. Hey, Jerry, tell us a little bit about your family. What on the personal side? Where do you live? Family, wife,
I
kids?
live in the Pittsburgh area with my wife and one of our kids. The other kids have moved out. I've got 7 kids. 5 of the 7 I see pretty much every day because they work for the family business. So, we're here in our home where our offices are. My wife's right there. We're at our dining room. We've been joking that if we gave a name to our business conglomerate, we would call it the Dining Room Group, because that's where we are right now. And we bought a big old farmhouse, and before we owned it, it had been a chiropractor's office, and so he had waiting rooms. And so those waiting rooms now are the various offices for the members of our family who work for Bowyer Research.
Nice.
So Christopher, Jeremy, Grace, Hope, Mercy, Charlie, and Jack, and 3 grandchildren.
How old are your grandchildren?
So let me see. Arthur is 5, and Ina is 2, and Felix is one
Ah, we have
and a half.
we have a 5-year-old and a 1-year-old, both granddaughters. And so what a joy! What a joy!
Yeah. Oh, very much so. We're looking forward. It's a Mima weekend coming up this weekend, so we're looking forward to them being over here and having a sleepover.
Tell us a little bit about your faith, Jerry. How did you grow up in the church? Like, what would that look like coming to Christ? And you talked a little bit about your church tradition. I'd be interested in what that is.
Yeah, I grew up in the Methodist church, and I I mean, when I was born into that church, it was very fire, brimstone, holiness, perfectionism, sort of Oberlin. You know what
Yeah,
that kind
yeah,
of
that's the history of it.
um, right, but that was kind of before I was conscious of anything. So that pastor retired. By the way, that pastor is my wife's grandfather, but we didn't know that.
Oh,
Like
nice.
we met, 18, 19 years later, 400 miles away, and then I started talking about my church, and she's like, "Wait, you were in Easton? Yeah, First United Methodist, yes. Was your pastor named Chester Buzzard? Yes." So, but we didn't know that we knew each other until much later. By the time that I was aware of things, probably like 8, 9, 10 years old, he had retired, and it was basically kind of Simon and Garfunkel songs and encounter groups, and they kind of reacted and went in the other
Yeah,
direction. None of it stuck really with me. As a teenager, I read a lot of atheist stuff, Marx and Nietzsche and Fromm and others, and you know, so I remember talking to the pastor about it and telling him that I didn't believe in God, and he was surprised by that, and he asked me why I didn't believe, and I asked him why I should believe, and he said because your mother and father believe, and I don't think it's genetics, so
right.
that wasn't persuasive to me. So did a lot of reading. Basically, spent most of my high school career skipping class, hanging out in the library, reading through Morton Adler's great books collection, kind of working my way through Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas and a bunch of the rest. And that convinced me that Christians were intellectually respectable, but it didn't convince me that Christianity was true. And then later, about age 19, I met a Presbyterian pastor, Orthodox Presbyterian Church pastor, who introduced me to presuppositional apologetics and the work of Cornelius Van Til. And he seemed to be the only one who was dropping depth charges down deep enough at the presuppositional level to kind of really deal with the issues that I was dealing with, right? Because I'd always read these people who were critical thinkers, and now we have critical race theory, and there's critical legal theory, and they're all basically the same thing. They're basically Marxist philosophers saying, don't believe authority. Don't believe the authority figures. It's all a power
Yeah.
game, or it's all a wealth game, or it's all a male domination game, or it's all a sexual repression game. But I came to realize through reading Van Til that they would do that to everybody else's presuppositions, but they never allowed anyone to do that to their presuppositions. They never turned their criticism, their critical stance on
Yeah, I never
themselves.
turned it inward.
Never turn it inward. So Marx says everyone does everything because of economic interests. It's like, well, how about you, Carl? Do you? Or Freud says everyone does everything because of their sexual repression. It's like, okay, how about you, Sigmund? Does that apply to you? Or Darwin says everyone who's has an opinion is really just instinct, and it's like, okay, Charlie, how about you? Are your theories just instinct? And at that point, I realized that you're either going to have Christian presuppositions or you're going to have utter collapse. And so I became a Christian, and was in the Orthodox Presbyterian Church for a while. I've been in a number of different church traditions, most recently serving in the Episcopal Church in the Pittsburgh area. But there came a point where, as an outspoken conservative,
Mm-hmm.
my position no longer became tenable. It was I was no longer able to serve. So I tried to just follow the example of the apostles, which is to stay until they push you out. So that's kind of the situation now.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah. Unfortunately, some of the mainline denominations have gone the wrong way. So it's tough. Yeah, to make that decision. I think I know people that have had to think through that. Do I stay and try to make a difference, or do I just leave and and move into something else that's more in line with the truth and orthodoxy? So yeah.
Yeah. And we went through that because our diocese actually underwent a split, and some people said, I can't stay. And some of us said, well, we're going to stay until we can't. Right.
Yeah.
And eventually it got to the can't.
Yeah.
But our conviction, not saying that someone's wrong to leave, our conviction is not until they push us out the door.
Make you leave.
Not until they say, you're not a deacon,
Yeah.
you can't preach, you can't serve the Eucharist, you can't anoint the sick. Don't call us, we'll call
Yeah.
you, right? At that point, then there's really nothing else to do.
Well, keep fighting the good fight, brother. That's good. Hey, Jerry, so this podcast is, as we talked about earlier, is a leadership podcast. We're here to learn from people who have been in leadership roles over a course of decades. And you look at your background, I mean, you've done a lot of leadership in various capacities. So one of the questions I always like to ask people is, what is your core leadership principle that you've developed over the years? Kind of that thing leadership to you is the foundation for you that you think about.
Core leadership principle. That's interesting. I don't know if there's one core. Kind of a lifelong theme is, seek after wisdom more than after silver and gold, and with all thy getting, get understanding. So I've tried to pursue that as a leader and as a follower. So there are times when there was more power or wealth available, but I've tried to follow the principle of I'm going to do the thing where I'm learning, where I'm gathering wisdom. I think another theme would be a strong focus on diligence, which I've tried to instill in the whole family business with Joseph, the patriarch, in Egypt under Potiphar, as an example, just to be a load-bearing structure, knowing that over the long run, responsibility will gravitate more and more to people who competently bear responsibility. And a related one to that is Jesus's parable about when you're invited to a dinner party, sit at the foot of the table, not at the head. So that, because if you sit at the head, the founder of the feast might say, go down to the foot. But if you're at the foot, he can say, come forward. So I think I've tried to gravitate to places where I've learned, not fret about the org chart a whole lot, or the resume. You're sort of building a corporate resume. Just try to go where the learning is. Try to be diligent there. Try to be the person who someone can depend on to get the thing done that needs to be done. Not put myself forward in that role. Not say I'm the leader, make me the leader, but just do that and then see what God does with that in terms of promotion. I'd say those would be the key themes.
I like that. I mean, that's a really, I think, godly, humble approach. And sometimes as leaders, we get caught up in building that resume, and it can be a trap. And especially what you said about continuous learning. And I can tell you, I mean, you're an intellectual. You study, you read deeply when you were young, and I found that as a leader, I mean, you can never stop challenging yourself because that's something you never master. I mean, I've had the privilege of leading people in some contexts for 25 years, and I just continue to want to learn about it. And I just read a book a couple of weeks ago on leadership, and still pulled things from that I had never really thought about before. And much of it was things I had thought about and needed reminding, or it's kind of like scripture. You keep reading it because you need to be sharpened and convicted, and things come at you a little different way if you're in a different area of life. So continuous learning is huge. It's got to be a lifelong pursuit, I think, for leaders and believers.
Yeah, I used to read a lot of leadership books, and I like leadership books. So when I say used to, that makes it sound like I don't think they're a good idea. I do think they're a good idea, but I did them because one of those phases in my career, I was a radio talk show host, and I did something that we called leadership radio, which is we had a kind of a mantra for that. Spend some time every day in the company of the greatest and wisest men and women who've ever lived. So it was leadership books, leadership studies, biographies, and histories. So what was interesting about that is I was on a radio station where, there's some radio stations, because of their the regulations, they're low power until sunup. I don't know if you're familiar with situations like that. Well, the ionosphere changes with sunup, and so the signal bounces differently.
Okay.
So you have to be low power until sunup, and then you can be high power. So the first hour, 5 o'clock to 6 o'clock in the morning, it wasn't like high stakes. So I could pretty much do whatever I wanted. So that's when I did all that leadership stuff. And then after the sun came up, I had to do whatever was the hot topic of the day, right? Elian Gonzalez, or recount in Florida, or Iraq War, or before that Clinton scandals, or whatever. There was always a play the hits thing, but I didn't want to play the hits because the hits are crises that the hits are talking about crises that would not have occurred if we got leadership right in the first place.
That's right. Yep.
So I tried to sort of tithe as much time as I could into leadership study at that time. So it was kind of my job to read a bunch of leadership books. I still do. I still read some, just not as many as I used to. But sometimes I'll read the same authors over and over again. There's some that just, have had a much bigger impact on me than others.
Yeah.
So
who are your favorites? Who you like most?
Big influence on me is George Gilder, who people don't usually think of as a leadership author. But he's an economist, and he's probably the most prescient technology thinker alive.
Gilder.
I mean, you go back. Yeah, George Gilder.
Okay.
You know who I'm talking
Nope.
about? Yeah. All right.
Cool.
George Gilder wrote the book that Ronald Reagan quoted most, called Wealth and Poverty. Went on to write a book called Life After Television in the 90s, in which he said your TV and your computer and your internet are all going to be on your phone. It's all going to be one thing. And everyone said he was crazy. And then he said, what's going to happen is there's going to be these currencies that are cryptographic currencies. So he's been way ahead of the curve. And what really helped me with Gilder is he got me into the idea of the learning curve, which is that you do a thing, and the more you do that thing, the better you get at it. With obvious, right? And the learning curve is the idea that roughly in almost every area of business, that with every doubling of production, there's a 30% decrease in unit cost. So that once you have a product or function or service that you're doing, scale up the
Yep.
volume, and you and your team will get so good at it that you can beat the competition cost-wise. I mean, you can beat on quality, but you can also beat on cost because you just become highly efficient, and that's the learning curve. So that's been really influential for me. And I first read him back when I was at Arthur Andersen, right out of college in the early '80s, and he said, these computers are going to be like machines, like in factories, but for knowledge workers.
Yeah.
And I took that to heart and threw myself into Lotus and then later Excel, and made it part of our culture. But my leadership culture and my families and my businesses are all the same because it's one thing, which is learn technology. Degrees, maybe, maybe not, but really just learn the
Learn
tech
it.
and get good at it. That was sort of when we homeschooled the kids, and what we required of them is to essentially get a good worldview, get exposed to the classics, have good character, and be productive. And being productive was largely a matter of learning how to apply technology. And so, two of them are successful in programming, and they're doing database work and now AI. So,
Yeah.
that's Gilder's influence.
What do you think about how should someone who's in middle management, maybe upper management right now, think about AI, Jerry, in the next 10 years, 15 years? I mean, there's so many wild theories and thoughts on that. I'd like to get your perspective.
Well, that's a good question. I've spent very, very little time in middle management. I spent, time in kind of in consulting, right? So we were dealing with middle or upper management,
Yep.
as an auditing firm and a tax firm. So I mean, we would deal with the controller of a company, but the controller would have somebody else who actually, ran the report, who knew
Right.
everything.
Right.
There was
Right.
always a Rosemary or a Sally or
Yep.
somebody who kind of knew what's going
Yep.
on. She didn't have a college degree, so she couldn't be high up in the org chart, but she knew everything. So we dealt with all sorts of people, and they're diligent. They don't get ahead that much, but no one dares fire them because the system shuts
The
down
break.
without
Yeah.
them. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So I haven't thought hard about middle management, um, because I've always tried to gravitate towards places where if I'm right, I'm rewarded, and if I'm wrong, I'm punished. And I think the challenge of middle management is that being right or wrong does not necessarily lead to success or failure.
Yeah.
That what
Less
I've
risk.
seen, what's that?
It's less risk.
Yeah,
Yeah.
just right. We just survive, right?
Yeah.
Survive and rise gradually to the top. Or I've seen people who are good kind of knife fighters. I've seen people fail upwards in shocking ways, right?
Yeah.
That it's like they leave the company to go, to another. They go to a stage up in another company in their middle management, and they were terrible
Hmm.
in the previous job. So they're able to kind of navigate that system. So I can't be highly encouraging, because mostly what I've seen as an outside observer in middle management situations is problems, like a lack of meritocracy. And I know there's sort of a debate about DEI and meritocracy. I'm not talking about that. I'm just talking about people who are good at managing their managers.
Yeah.
People who are good at sort of getting ahead. And I've seen, that happen. And so I don't think I could do that. So I guess my sense is from outside that being a diligent person in middle management involves a great deal more patience than being an entrepreneur.
Yes. Yeah.
Because because entrepreneur, I mean, entrepreneurs, it's hard for an entrepreneur to get ahead unless they make good decisions. And it's hard for them to do poorly unless they make a fair number of bad decisions, although there can be bad timing. But there's so much whim in a corporate hierarchy, in my experience. somebody just likes somebody or doesn't.
Yeah.
That's got to be a really tough
That
environment, and
plays
that's a
into it.
gift,
Yeah.
right? And you read in the Bible, there are people who are stewards, right? There's somebody who's working in Herod's house, or you got Huzzah, who's the treasurer, and his wife Susanna is a follower of Jesus. You've got these stories in the book of Kings. You have a lot of middle management in the Bible,
Yeah.
right? And a lot of middle management is do the right thing and trust God, but you might not be rewarded. You might just get your head cut off.
Yeah.
And you might have a bad boss. And how do you navigate that? So I'm sorry, this isn't helpful because I'm telling you all the problems I see for people in middle management.
Well, and I think about, that's what the whole question on
All the
AI
challenges.
is, yeah, and
Right.
the question
Oh
on
yeah,
AI,
your question was about AI.
like
Yeah,
what do
right.
we, as someone who's in that level, I mean, do we have to be early adopters? Should it be we thinking about it every day, using it for as much as possible, let it play out? It's interesting because I mean, I work in manufacturing, and I've been in it long enough to have seen the wave of automation, right?
Mhm.
Robotics and machine tools that 30 years ago people didn't really think about very much, and I've seen the wave come through and how we adapted to it in our industry and how workers have had to adapt to it. And I wonder to myself, is that what, is AI just going to be another wave of automation for the knowledge worker in the next 10 years, 5 years? And people are talking about it's going to take over the world and we're all going to die. And we know as believers that God is sovereign and he will
Right.
allow it only to happen what he wants to happen. But so I just wonder, like, how should we be thinking about that? We play with it a little bit. We dabble in it, and some companies are going after it full head of steam to use it as users, not developers. I'm talking about just people who might use it and
Right.
leverage it to do their
Right.
job
Right.
better.
I see. Your question was a whole lot more about AI than it was about middle
Yeah, no, that's
management, and
okay though, because
I
your
gave you
insight's interesting. That's
that
good.
long spiel about middle management. All right, so AI. I'm pretty much all in terms of leveraging it. We use AI a lot. We feel like it levels the playing field for a small firm like
Yeah,
ours against the big firms. So, for example, using that, we were able to kind of leap ahead of a firm that's been around for decades longer than we are, in terms of producing a robust set of research on a topic. That we were kind of a new entrant into the field and shoot just right over top of them. And it's interesting. It's got one of our kids, our youngest daughter, is autistic, and she's our AI specialist, and she has a certain gift for prompt engineering.
mm,
I think because of her neurodiversity, right? So she pretty much single-handedly, leapt us ahead of a company with 1,000 workers
yeah,
and a couple of decade head start on us just by using
and
AI.
using it well.
So, and using it
Yeah,
well. So, I mean, obviously, you have to be really cautious because AI lies. It's not a truth
yep,
machine.
yep,
It is an association machine. It hallucinates. So I like to say AI is absolutely terrific technology, just so long as the answer doesn't have to be right.
right, right,
So when people say, "Well, then when doesn't the answer have to be right?" And I say, for the first draft, the answer doesn't have to
right,
be right.
yeah,
You just has to identify certain things and certain opportunities. So I do these quarterly calls for Kingdom Advisors where we look at sort of the economics. And I was looking at the futures market for presidential futures, who's most likely to win the election. And Biden had been pulling ahead of Trump, and he pulled ahead in this probability market on March 29th. Why? So I asked AI, what happened on March 29th that would be relevant to the a political contest between Trump and Biden? And it gave me 7 or 8 answers, and 6 of them were just nonsense. What are you talking about, right? But one of them was like, oh, there was a huge fundraiser for Biden that day. And Clinton and Obama
yeah,
were
yep,
both there, and he raised $26 million. It's like, oh, that's it. The party got behind him. So most of what AI told me was nonsense, but one of the things rang true. So AI can serve up options
yeah,
to you. And so I love it. I'm not with the Christians who are always suspicious of new technologies. That's not my orientation at
Yeah. Yep.
all.
Yep.
I think we should be first adopters, and first adopters means either developers or first adopters, because that means we steer it in the right
Yeah.
direction.
Yep.
I can tell you AI is our enemy philosophically. I mean, I spent an hour debating ChatGPT-4 about evolution, one evening, and it just read like another atheist troll on social media.
Yeah. That's great.
And so it's like, all right, I know where it's getting its information, so don't trust it.
Yeah.
But it's a pet, right? So you got to train it to
Yeah.
do the right
I've been
thing.
able to, as I mentioned, the podcast I do here it's a ministry, it's a hobby. I mean, I have a full-time job, but I've been able to leverage it to broaden my content and much faster. So I've been able to use it to do a lot, because my podcast all generate a transcript. So I have the entire conversation, so I can summarize chapters. It's been incredible. Again, I'm a dabbler. I'm not even near where you guys are, but it's been an incredible tool. But
Well, we're not even near where we want to be, right? So we're trying to up our AI game. I think it's a powerful technology. I also think it's not the utopian idol that the techno utopians in Silicon Valley make it out to be. It's not going to become smarter than human beings. We cannot outcreate God. Therefore, we can't create something that's better than us.
right. That's
We
right.
are we're the greatest thing that God created in material reality. There's nothing higher than us in the created order. So we can't make something better than us. If we could make something better than us, we'd be better makers than God.
Yeah.
So I'm not afraid that it will surpass us. I'm afraid that we'll misuse it.
Yep.
I'm afraid that we'll make an idol out of it, thinking that it can surpass us. But I'm not afraid that it's going to get smarter than we are. I don't see how it possibly could be,
Yeah.
because we can't possibly outcreate
No, that's
God.
good biblical logic on that. Hey, different question, Jerry. Think back when you were younger, leader in a leadership role. I like to ask people about something they struggled with and as a leader and how they overcame it, because I think there's probably other people listening that maybe are going through that and can learn from your hindsight. So leadership early in your career, mistakes you made, things you struggled with. How did you learn through that?
Well, it's mostly been mistakes and struggles, so it would be really hard
That's how we learn, right?
to nail that down.
A certain
You know, I
theme maybe that you had when you were younger leader that was a little more difficult to overcome.
I think the first major struggle for me was that I was an accounting major, went to work for a big accounting firm, and I was not well suited to that. So I was working outside my set of gifts. Now, you might say, well, you work with finance and you look at balance sheets or whatever. Yeah, that's different than being,
Very.
yeah, because I mean, the other thing is tick marks and filling out forms. And I just like hit that wall, and I had trouble getting around that. Now, I was able to succeed to some degree because I was interested in information technology. So I was able to do some technology fixes to some things, but just being like another drone in the accounting hive, I failed at that. I just was not good at that. So, I did that because it was sort of like guaranteed money.
Yeah.
The other thing was, when I ran a think tank in my early 30s, and it had one particular major funder, and we went out there and we battled in public policy arenas, and we did a whole lot better than anyone ever expected. We won a lot of battles, and that created enemies, and enemies talked to our board members and funders to sort of try to get even. And I found myself in a position of crisis with a major funder, despite the fact that we won.
Yeah.
Despite the fact we were given a mission by this funder, and what he said is, you're not going to win, it's not going to succeed, but we want you to at least try. And we tried, and by God's grace, we won. And that created ill will, and then people sort of whispered and cocktail parties, and all of a sudden we're in trouble. And that was one of the big wake-up calls of my life. That's when I realized I did not want to be in a situation. That's when I didn't want to be in nonprofit world, and particular in sort of public policy nonprofit world, where you could almost get fired or lose funding for getting it right. So at that point, I gravitated over to I will take a lower status
Yeah.
job in a situation where if I'm right and it works, I get reward to take as much whim out of it as I
Yeah.
can. So I'd say,
Even if you make enemies being right in the business world, you get
yeah, I mean, even if you make
less
enemies
politics.
doing the mission,
Yeah.
right? If, so I'd say those are the two big. Those are kind of, well, one was in my mid-20s and the other was in my mid-30s. So I think those are probably the two big crises. I suppose the other one was, a little bit later. I kind of got pulled into fame a little bit too. I did a lot of media, and media is hard. Everyone wants to. A lot of people wanted to be on TV and radio, and I had gotten over that and was getting on TV and radio, and I kept doing it even when it didn't make any sense because everyone wants it. Therefore, it must be
Yeah.
good. Therefore, I should do it. And we can't get into all this, but I, read a lot about the anthropologist Rene Girard, who talks about rivalry, imitation, and rivalry, about how people want a thing just because another person wants it. And I realized that that was going on, so I sort of dropped out. So, there are these crises where where I learn something painful and then generally make a career change and sort of start over to some. In each of those cases, I sort of had to start over
Yeah.
a little bit. So I've got, if the career path is like Spike, wow, this is really promising guy, crash. Then Spike, oh wow, who is this guy? Crash. And then, that's kind of been the pattern so far. And right now I'm on an upswing, but I also know they don't last forever.
Well, it makes me think about something I've had to figure out in my career, and that you eventually figure out what you're good at, what God's called you, gifted you to do, and being comfortable and okay with that, even if that's not what other people say success looks like or great looks like. I mean, I've struggled with that. Well, that must be right because that's where all the fame and glory is or whatever. But getting to a point where you're like, no, I like what I'm doing, what I get to do is what I love to do, and I'm okay. I'm comfortable saying, good for him, good for her, not interested. And I think that comes with some maturity and some learning. At least it has for me over a few decades. I'm a slow learner, so
Yeah, I'm kind of reminded of a conversation an older friend had with me, advice he gave me during that think tank situation where there was alienation from the funder and some members of the board. So we fought through that actually, and we won again over the internal opposition, right? And then my friend, who was also on the board of directors and one of the funders, said, "Do you want to leave or stay?" And I said, I want to stay. We just won. Why would I leave? And he said, I'm asking if you want to leave or stay. And I realized that the only reason I wanted to stay is because there had been a battle for control of the organization. So therefore, it must be worth fighting for. We were able to sort of push out the troublemaking board members. And therefore, we won the prize, but I didn't like it anymore.
yeah.
And so he was a mature Christian believer, mature entrepreneur who asked a question that had never occurred to me to ask. Do you actually like it now? And I didn't like the job anymore. Right?
Yeah.
So I ended up fighting for control, fighting for survival, surviving, and then leaving because I didn't like it
Yeah.
anymore.
Yep. I had one of my greatest mentors in my career told me, the day that I wake up and don't want to come in here and do this work, I'm just not gonna anymore and I thought that's mind boggling to me to think that you can do that. But I understand more and more, what he was talking about, finding joy and satisfaction in the work through the good and bad, but knowing this is what I'm called to do. This is what God's given me to do. And it's not what everybody else is called to do. It can be very different, and that's fine, and that's okay. I'm super comfortable. I am super comfortable walking into a manufacturing plant every day. I love it. I absolutely love it. And I know a lot of people who would have zero desire to do that, and I'm okay with that. And it took me a long time to be like, a lot of people think that's bad. It's, oh, you don't want to go do and, work in a factory, and that's not good. And I'm like, I've made a career of it and love it. and seeing how God's worked through me and in me in that. And
Why do they say it's not
yeah,
good? What do they think's wrong with
well,
it?
I grew up in a very blue collar area, and it was just a lot of dead end jobs.
That's
Factory
it.
rats. That's a terminology that was thrown around a lot. You just go
I
do
see.
a job that has no meaning. But again, as I've also come to mature in my understanding of Scripture and how God has made us to work, and reading books like David's book and other authors
Right.
who write about that, to say that there's inherent value in the work that you're doing, not just in the tangible benefits of getting money, getting a paycheck, providing for your family. It's more than that. And it took me a long time to really understand that and see work, no matter what it is, as long as it's not inherently sinful work. The majority of
Right.
work isn't, but
Right.
that there's value in the work, in doing the work. And I look at my work totally differently than I used to when I look at products that we make, people that are
Right.
being developed and learning and growing. I'm like, these are all characteristics of God, creation, right? Sanctification, not sanctification sometimes in a spiritual sense in the workplace, but that growth and development of the human mind and learning. And that's all what God designed us to do, as well as, you know, repent and believe that he is who he says he is. He has also created us to work. So anyways, getting through
I mean,
that.
I read Genesis 1 and I see, a manufacturing process,
Yeah. Yeah.
and St. Chrysostom called God the master builder.
Yeah.
So, I think it's the philosophers who maybe have to explain why what they do for a living is valuable.
Yeah. Right. Right.
I don't think people who work in factories need to explain it. I think it's pretty tangible. This is a point that Peter Thiel has made, a very successful entrepreneur, in another of my favorite business books, Zero to One, that in our lifetime we have advantaged jobs and careers that are focused in and around electrons and not ones that are focused in and around atoms.
Yeah.
Right? So if something weighs something, we think that's kind of inferior work. And if something is just information, we think it's superior. And that doesn't make any sense. So I mean, part of it is probably the regulatory environment is more favorable towards the the e economy.
Yeah.
But honestly, I would say in general, the e economy is more likely to be parasitical and exploitative than the atom economy. So there's not a lot of manufacturing that's going on that I think of as bad or exploitative,
Yeah.
right? I mean, there's maybe some things, but I mean, if someone's making electronic goods, if somebody's making automobile parts or automobiles, they're making components for homes or whatever they're manufacturing, those are for the vast majority of things are inherently good.
Yeah.
But if you look at the quote knowledge economy, computer program, increasingly it's social media, which is monetizing conflict and
Yeah.
propaganda,
Yeah.
streaming services, which are in essence addictive, really. You binge watch,
Yeah.
something that's addictive. And I mean, sometimes it's sexually exploitative or violent, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's perfectly good entertainment, but do you really need to do 10
Right.
hours of it
Right.
on a Saturday?
Right.
Right? No, that's addictive behavior.
Yeah.
That's unhealthy behavior. And increasingly gambling.
Yeah. Oh yeah, for
You know,
sure. Yep.
right? And which is starting to basically sort of dominate sports broadcasting now and streaming services, and you go from video games into gambling. So I'd say the knowledge worker economy is getting to be a high proportion of the value of that is
Yeah.
exploitative, and I don't think that's true of manufacturing.
That's a great point. I love manufacturing, and now I love it more. So thank you. That's great. No, yeah, I mean, I've spent my whole adult life watching things get built and made, and yeah, I love it. Love the sounds, the smells, the sights, and
Mhm.
it's fascinating. It never gets old for me. We've talked a lot about leadership authors. You've hit on a couple books, Jerry, but one of the things I always like to do is share with share with those that are listening other sources that you would recommend from a leadership perspective, podcasts, books, who you follow, who you like. You've thrown out a couple, but any others that come to mind that you would recommend?
Uh, yeah, like I said, I don't do a lot of leadership books and podcasts just now. I've been on a little bit though of a Dan Sullivan kick, the strategic entrepreneur.
Okay.
I don't know if you're
I'm
familiar with
not.
him.
No.
It's probably the biggest of the coaching programs, entrepreneur coaching programs. So I have been listening to that. And a lot of it is about um, kind of in that 80-20 rule stuff, where you get 80% of your value from
Yeah.
20%
Pareto,
of
right?
your, right,
Yeah.
of the Pareto
Yeah.
principle, right? And I tried to practice that earlier in life, and then I've kind of got into just like 80-hour work weeks again, and I'm trying to get back to that Pareto principle, finding that 20%, staffing up a little more, staffing up sooner than I would have
Yeah.
probably before. So I listened to them. Another area that I maybe is underutilized is I think that entrepreneurs maybe need to pay a little bit more attention to fitness, health, and longevity. It is an extremely high stress
Yeah.
lifestyle. So, I've had a conversation with my cardiologist recently, and he said there's kind of we see the same pattern over and over again. He's a concierge, so he's expensive. So he tends to have, affluent people or someone who really needed a lot of help, like me. And he sees people who, when they're focusing on the career, they're spiking cortisol, they're putting on weight, they're increasing their heart attack
Yeah.
risk, right?
Yeah.
And then there's a crisis, and then they kind of deal with it. And I think that I'm beginning to think more and more about sort of the area under the curve of productivity. So if you're doing a little less, but you do it for 10 more each year, but you do it for 10 more years, you're doing a lot
Yeah.
more. So, taking a certain amount of time and setting it aside for exercise and other fitness activities, and thinking about those sorts of things is something. So I kind of listen to podcasts in that zone, like say for instance Peter Attia or Dr. Peter Attia or some of those
Okay.
folks.
Good.
So I think that's an underutilized. It's almost like you can only be successful in one thing. You think if you're going to focus on your career, you can't focus on the other
Yeah.
thing. And I think you can do both and probably get more career advancement, by keeping an edge longer,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? Because, as you think about it, let's say somebody's in their 40s or 50s, and so they're middle management, they've learned a lot, right? But also the energy starts to run down a little bit, and the cognitive edge can start to get blunted. But imagine if that didn't happen. Imagine if you had your 30-year-old brain with your 55-year-old knowledge base. And I think that's, doable, to some
Yeah.
degree, with exercise and fasting and, focusing on nutrition. So I think there's an edge there. I think there's maybe like a 5 IQ point edge,
Yeah.
and if you're staying on top of that.
Well,
So
and
I've been focusing on that. That's kind of most of my podcast listening is probably
okay.
that right now.
No, I mean, a couple of years ago, I moved into the role I'm in now, and came out of a lot more stressful, a lot more reactive roles that I had been in a couple of them in back to back. And when I moved into the role I am now, I lost a bunch of weight. I lost like 40 pounds. My resting heart rate, thanks to Apple Watch, stuff you don't even think about. And I was months into the job, and because I'm a data guy, I'm looking at some charts and graphs one night on my health app, and I'm like, my resting heart rate has dropped like, I don't remember what it was, but from like 80 to 60 or 65 in the
Yeah.
3 or 4 months that I took this job. And what I'll say, going back to your point, is that I feel way more focused and sharp now, a lot more proactive in how I spend my time and how I'm thinking through my work. Now I'm thinking about next year, the year after. What's our vision? Where are we moving towards? And not, in past roles where it's I'm gonna wake up and I'm gonna have about a 1 hour time horizon today all day, and then I'm gonna come home and go to bed and do it again. I'm gonna eat like crap. I'm not gonna go to the gym. And you're totally stressed
Yep.
out. I think just the mental exhaustion and the stress, the cortisone or whatever it is that's in your brain, and you're not going out and running on or getting on the elliptical and burning that off. It just clouds your thinking. In my experience, it's just absolutely clouded my thinking. Whereas now I feel that I am able to think a lot clearer and make a lot better decisions because it's really just a physical um, mindset, what I've done health wise.
So you're not stealing from your career. I mean, if you're fanatical about it, you probably are, right? But if you are, if you're doing, if you're doing exercise in some kind of diligent way, you're not stealing from your career.
right,
You're helping it.
right,
Now, I'm not saying go out. And there was a time when I was doing like 90 minutes a day of cardio.
hmm
Well, I was stealing from my career, right? But you don't have to do that,
no,
right? So, some weightlifting, some sprinting, some
yep,
intervals or something
yep,
like that. You can do that in a short, my workout, my wife and I do sprints. That's like a 20-minute workout.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Then 15 minutes of weight
yep,
training, 35 minutes, and we're wiped out,
yeah,
right? A couple times a
yep.
week or whatever. So you're taking an hour away from your work, but you're not. You're making every other hour more productive.
Well, that's exactly right. When you are at work, it's far more productive. Yeah, and a good week for me is 3 times at the gym, and I'm 20
Okay.
minutes on the elliptical, get my heart rate up, and then
Yep.
the rest of that hour is weight training. And if I'm doing that
Yep.
even 3 times a week, it's huge game changer mentally, just the mental focus as well as how you feel. And again, you and I both have grandchildren now, right? So I like to go out and play in the yard with them a little bit and not be totally exhausted, can't keep up with them. So
Yeah, and sometimes I've gotten the sense. I read a blog once where someone in was writing for a theological website, and he was talking about fitness, and he felt like he needed to. There's like 3 paragraphs of I'm not saying that the body's more important than the soul, and I'm not saying blah blah blah, and it's like he had to sort of overcome some kind of
yeah,
objection, right? Like that there's something wrong with a health focus, and I would really love to see Christian culture shift so that it instead of like you have to explain yourself if you're trying to be healthier and live longer
yeah,
because that's worldly, as opposed to that's sort of a default culture of excellence and glorying God,
exactly.
glorifying God in
Yeah,
everything,
yeah,
right? So what if we have a culture of excellence? What if the baseline expectation is that you're a follower of Jesus? What does the gospel say? He does all things well.
yes,
What if the basic expectation is that in every area of your life you're improving
yep,
to glorify him?
yep,
That's not shaming somebody, because everybody has areas where they're going to fall behind. So if somebody's not fit,
yep,
it's just saying start out, just set to be the best you can be in every area, in your career, in your family life. And it's like church is okay with you saying it's okay to be good in your family life. They're all right with that, right?
yeah,
We just had Mother's Day, which is the highest, that's the highest attendance church Sunday of the year. So you don't have to convince church world that it's important to focus on family, but you seem to have to convince church world that it's okay to be good at your career,
yeah, you do. Yeah, yeah,
or that it's okay to, lift weights and get strong,
yep,
and to watch your diet and try to, live a long life, or to read books and try to grow intellectually.
yep,
I think we should be striving for excellence in all things, and that's spiritual. That's a spiritual
yep,
thing. Being good at your job is spiritual. Working on being healthy is spiritual. And yes, being a husband, father, grandparent, that's spiritual. We already know that already. Being a good church member or clergy, yes, that's spiritual. But we already know that's spiritual already. What we have to do is maybe get to the point where we see all those other things as spiritual and not in competition.
right,
And this is a point that David makes. This work-life balance thing that people say is really weird because work is half of life at least.
yes,
So you don't say family life balance, you don't say church life balance, right? But somehow work has to earn its place at the table with the rest of life. So you work and then you do
yeah,
life. So work isn't part of life then. That's a very strange way
Well,
of
and I
looking at
think
the
that I
world.
think that the mindset that's crept in, it goes back to what I said earlier, where it's work is only a necessary evil to earn some money, to give to the church, to support your family, and then get out of there as soon as you can. And then that leads to a lack of excellence at work because it's not even a good thing. It's an evil thing. And if I didn't have to do it, I wouldn't have to. I mean, I think that mindset has gone from our cultural American domain
Right.
into the church. And you
Yeah.
wrote about it in that recent article. You talked about, we're going to work later, we're working less, we're retiring
Yeah.
earlier because work's like, no, 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 no. We want to try to get out of it. And the more I've read, like David Bonson's book, Jordan Rayner put one out called The Sacredness of Secular Work earlier this year. So reading these books and sharpening my own thinking, and I think into more of a biblical mindset of work, then I start hearing the conversations around me outside of the church, at work, inside of the church at times too. And I think, no, this is really ingrained in our language even, that we
Y-
celebrate early retirement. We celebrate not working, like getting out of work early, leaving early, working less hours. How can we have a, 3-day work week, a 4-day work week? And yeah, it's like it's the evil to be avoided versus this is I love to go work. I love it. I
Right.
love to go and
I mean,
create and make and fix and repair and build relationships and build teams. So, anyways,
how many commercials for, financial advisors are you're going to retire and, run a vineyard or something like that? Or, I mean, is that the goal, to have a 20-year hobby vacation at the end? I mean, if you were good at your job, if you're good at your job, you take from the world. If you're very good at your job and you stop it early, you've taken something very valuable from the
yeah,
world.
yeah. David talks about that in his book, right? Like all the people who are retiring early, and we miss out, the generations that miss out on that knowledge and experience and training and
Yeah.
mentorship.
And I think in the church conversation, we've kind of gotten maybe a little bit past the idea that secular work is bad, where, I mean, but still, you get the cookie for the churchy stuff, right? So, hey, Sunday school teachers, stand up if you're a Sunday school teacher, right? Or if you run a small group, stand up. They should be honored. But how many times, if you're an employer, stand
Yeah,
up. If you've been at your job for 40 years, faithfully doing that job, stand up.
yeah.
We if you got a promotion recently,
Oh,
stand. We should that should be happening as much as, oh, so and so's going to seminary and has decided to become a pastor
yeah,
or a
yeah,
missionary, and then a wave of applause. That's great.
yep.
Well, excuse me, who's paying for that missionary
That's right.
salary?
Yeah. Now, one of the
The pay
things
the payroll person.
one of the things that I mentioned Jordan Rayner. Do you know who Jordan Rayner is? If you so
Hmm,
does a lot of
sorry.
faith and work content, writing. He's got a podcast. Love him. Great guy. Great brother in Christ. He tells a story about being at I think a youth conference he was speaking at, and he says, if I get the story right, I think I got it right. But he says, normally you're like, they'll say, hey, raise your hand if you feel called to missions, if you feel called to the pastorate. And he's like, I'm going to start off saying, raise your hand if you feel called to go into marketing, to go into business, to go into, and people start standing up. And it's like, those are all callings that God is, if you're a believer and you're going to do that, those are sacred callings. Yes, we absolutely need to honor, love, support our pastors and our missionaries. But to your point, there's not all of us are called to do that and shouldn't be and can't be. And we need to look at our vocations as a calling and more than a
Right.
mission, more than even a mission field to go in. And I see value in my work because I can go share the gospel, and I can. But this is a point that Jordan makes. 99.5 or 8% of your time, you're not sharing the gospel. Now, when you get to, praise the Lord. And if you're doing your work well, people may respect you enough to listen to you. But the vast majority of the time, you're just doing your work. And we are called to do it with excellence and do it to the absolute best of our ability and
Right.
glorify God through that, doing that work that way. So,
And if it's a calling, it's displeasing to God to not follow it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we read the story of Jonah, who was called to be a missionary, and he pulled back from his
Yeah.
calling, and terrible things happened. Well, what if your calling is
That's
manufacturing
right.
and you pull back? You're like Jonah,
Yep.
not
Yep.
doing what he's
Yep.
called to do. And woe be to the religious leader who somehow signals to somebody who is called to work in manufacturing that they shouldn't
Yeah.
do it.
I've been in 25, 24 years, I've been asked twice about, have you thought about going into full-time ministry? And both times, praise the Lord, I've been like, absolutely not. No, I'll serve. I serve as an elder. I'll lead clubs, groups, VBS. I'm there, but absolutely not. And I think it
Yeah.
would be a disaster because that's not what God's called me for or wired me for at all.
Right.
And yeah, I think that people make that mistake. So because it's seen as what must be the best thing, and it's not for everybody. It's not the right thing for everybody. Hey, another quick question on leadership for those who are maybe earlier in their journey, in their career, Jerry. What would be advice if someone came to you, even maybe one of your kids or somebody that you know who's younger and looks up to you as a mentor and said, I have been given my first promotion as a supervisor, team leader, manager, something like that. What advice would you give them on how to approach that leadership position in general, without knowing specifics on what the role would be, but in general, how would you direct them to start off on the right foot as a leader?
Write things down. I mean,
Yeah,
honestly, I've seen so many people fail, sort of like early in their leadership career, where because they simply just don't write things down. I know that sounds it's like so, elementary, but I've seen it over and over again. And I don't know. It's partly an age at a certain age when you're young, your executive function hasn't really grown that much. So I've noticed that for young people, they can struggle if they have 5 things to
yeah,
do. They let me put it this way: you're doing a thing and that's working, but you're also managing yourself now. So you have to kind of get up above yourself
yeah,
and say, "Okay, Jerry, you just did item number 1. When you're done with item number 1, it's time to do item number 2." And the ability to get up above, like to get out of line land and up above that, I think doesn't really happen for people unless they write things down. Now you can use software, you can type it,
sure. Yep,
in
yep,
Microsoft To Do or Project or something like
yep.
that, or however your neurology works. The other thing is, maybe this is something different people have different challenges. I Sometimes young men come into a situation and they've been given a chance at leadership and they think they really deserve it. Finally, they're in charge. And so they're not listening.
Yeah,
They just take charge, right? As opposed to doing a lot of information gathering. So I would say if you're young and you're in a position of new leadership authority, do a lot of information
yeah.
gathering. And there are people you're leading who probably know more than you do.
Guaranteed.
Just because you're the
Guaranteed.
leader doesn't mean you know
Yeah,
the most.
yep.
It might be somebody likes you, or it might be because you have energy, or it might be because you have potential. It doesn't mean you have the most
Yeah,
knowledge.
you don't. Probably, most likely, you don't.
Right. And there could be somebody who knows a lot more than you do, and they don't want a promotion. They like their life the way it
That's right.
is, right? So I mentioned the Rosemarys and Sallys or whatever.
Mm,
She doesn't want to be the
no,
controller. She wants a 40-hour work week. She doesn't want a 60 or 70-hour work week, but she knows more than the person above her on the org chart.
yeah,
So if you just got put up a rung on the org chart, realize you probably don't know more than everybody below you, and you certainly do not know more than everybody combined.
guaranteed. Yeah. I thought and if anyone who's listening to my podcast hears me say this all the time, I had this advice given to me a long time ago. Listen, learn, then lead. Just take that approach, especially when you're new to a team or, you come into an organization new. I think the other one I'll just hit on too, the writing things down. It made me think back when I was a first time supervisor and I had a mentor who was an older supervisor And I remember we had a daily schedule and about 3 pages usually, and he would fold that into three where it fit in your back pocket. And all day long when we were walking around the plant, if someone asked him about something, typically our employees, our team members, he'd write it down. And at the end of
Yes.
the day, everything on that sheet was either crossed off as he followed up with them and he checked on this and checked on that, or if not, it got transferred to tomorrow's. But everybody knew if Mark said he was going to do something, he did it. And to this day, I mean, I carry most of the time my phone, but I have a notebook that I carry around, and if we're out in the shop or whatever, and if I say I'm going to do something, I write it down because I'll forget if not, and then my credibility, trust just gets eroded. So just for that reason alone, write it down so you don't forget it.
It's so obvious, but I've seen it violated so
Yeah,
often.
yeah. You get people that just say, I saw it become a huge problem with team members because you tell them with good intentions, yep, I'll check on that for you. Yep, I'll do that. Yep, I'll do that. And you do none of it or 90% of it, you forget. And now everybody just thinks you're either lazy or a liar or both. And that
Right.
you're not leading anybody because they can't stand you.
Yeah, I gave the commencement speech at my alma mater at Robert Morris, and that was the first item that I
I love
mentioned.
it.
I didn't do anything uplifting. It was just, here's what you got to do. And the first one was, do not dare ever show up to a meeting with your boss without a paper and pencil, without a pad and pencil in your hand.
Yeah, that's true. Absolutely true. When my team does, when we meet, and I do that with my boss, and I'm 52 years old and I've been in leadership for a long time. But if I'm going to a meeting with my boss, I've got my notebook because I want to make darn sure. But even with people who are my, say, subordinates, because it's just as important for me there that if they ask me to do something and I tell them I'm going to do it, I'm going to do it. So super important.
Yeah.
Good.
There's one other thing I want to mention that I just kind of occurred to me that we tried to instill in our family business, which is that if you've got a responsibility, you're a step in the process. There's somebody just before you,
Yep.
and there's somebody just after you. Take extra responsibility for the step just before and just after. In other words, don't just be responsible for your part. You are fully accountable for your part. But if there's something, don't just, if it's not a valid excuse, so and so didn't give me the thing that I need to do something with. Talk to that person, like double check it. Same, like check after, so that there's double coverage for each stage in the process, because everybody is checking the step before them and they're checking the step after them. Related to that is something we call 3-point communication, which is, I guess, we don't just call it that, but that's a common thing. So around here, if I'm giving an assignment to somebody, they say it back to me, and then I say it back to them. And we have so fewer misunderstandings. Like, hey, I need you to run this data on such and such, Chris. And Chris is saying, all right, you're saying I need to run the data on such and such. And it's like, that's right, Chris, you need to run the data on such and such. It gets said 3 times.
That's intense. That's good communication.
To lock it in.
That is good. Yeah. No, the process you talked about, the process steps in manufacturing, we've tried to teach this probably goes back 15 years ago, where we started to really try to teach people that they have internal customers. Their colleagues are their internal customers. So think about that.
Yes.
You're not, I know that Joe that does the next operation, whatever, you don't like him or this or that or the other thing, but he is your internal customer. And if you send him a bad part, he gets to hold you accountable because he's your customer. And once you get that culture built in and they actually start treating each other that way, it changes everything.
Right.
I have a couple other questions for you before we wrap up. I would like to ask if you know of anybody else that would be a good guest on the podcast, someone, out in industry and leadership who can offer thoughts and advice on leading, and, someone who's been doing it for a while. So what do you think?
Let me think about that and get back to you, because I don't want to
That's
put
fair.
someone on the spot
That's totally
publicly.
fair.
Yeah.
That's totally fair. What would be the best way for people if they want to follow you, get in touch with you? They've listened today and thought this is a super fascinating guy, which I think so. What's the best way for them to stay in touch?
I'm on social media. I try to share what I'm doing out there and interact with people. Social media can become addictive and distracting. I find it to be a value add, but that's because I block everything that isn't.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if an argument is developing with somebody, if it's like that's not productive,
Yeah.
just hit the block button. Only talk to people with whom it's productive. So I'm on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter. I'd say probably the highest quality interaction is on LinkedIn by its very nature.
Yeah.
That LinkedIn doesn't seem to run on conflict,
Right.
whereas
Yeah.
Facebook and
Like
Twitter
Twitter. Twitter is like
do.
the other extreme, right? That's the fuel. That's
Right,
the fuel for that
right.
engine.
Now, a certain amount of my job is conflict, like if we're holding a company
Yeah.
accountable, so I'll use Twitter as a tool in that particular case. That heat can serve. It can be a
Yep.
tool, right? As a fallback, right? You don't start out with conflict. So I'm easy to find. Just spell it right.
Yeah.
Bowyer, Boyer,
Yeah.
Bowyer. Think of it that
Yeah.
way. And yeah, go ahead and send me a connect or a friend or a connect or follow me on Twitter and be part of the
Great.
conversation.
No, and I'll link to those in the show notes. So we do audio and then also have YouTube channel. I see you do too for your podcast. So you've got a podcast. We'll link to all that so people can check you out and follow and be a part of what you're doing, learn from you. So hey,
Good.
I thank you for your time. I know you're super busy. If you think of someone that could be a guest, please connect me. That's how I keep this thing going. So I appreciate your time today, brother, though, and thank you for what you're doing.
Appreciate your time. Thank you.
All right, man. Thank you.